But first, the vice president of Chinese telecoms company Huawei has written an open letter urging the UK government to go ahead with the deal to allow the company to roll out 5G in the UK following the coronavirus crisis. Huawei's UK chief, Victor Zhang, says in this letter, there are those who choose to continue to attack us without presenting any evidence. Disrupting our involvement in the 5G rollout would do Britain a disservice. At the same time, China also claims that it has secured a guarantee from Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab that the coronavirus outbreak will not be politicized and that he would not seek retribution from China for causing the outbreak. Well, I'm joined now by Sir Iain Duncan Smith, who calls this response from Huawei arrogant. Sir Iain Duncan Smith, thank you so much for joining us today. This is quite an extraordinary letter. My reading of it, though, is that clearly Huawei know this deal is under massive pressure. Is that how you took it?
I suppose they're trying to preempt what they might be concerned about. I'm never quite sure what goes on in the mind of the people that run Huawei, or in fact those in China. My concerns about Huawei and China in general are long predate the coronavirus saga.
Likewise.
And I think the real issue here isn't will we have retribution with China? The truth is, first of all, China is in complete denial at the moment about whether or not the pandemic started in China. There was a statement, I think, today made in where they talk about the idea of everybody having to get together and no one should prejudge everything as to where it broke out. Well, this is ridiculous, really.
Yeah.
And then there's been a lot of misinformation. So first of all, they're in denial. It seems to be they were absolutely in denial about the figures at the beginning, still in denial about that right now. And we go wider than that. Beyond coronavirus, I don't think Huawei should be involved in any of our systems. I would get rid of them right now. They are run by the Chinese government. They are funded essentially by the Chinese bank. They spent their whole time, as a result, strategically, basically getting rid of most of the free world's systems providers by underbidding all of them, relentlessly underbidding every one of them, even when their bids, would have been ridiculously low and no normal company could possibly have existed on this. And bit by bit, they've driven them out. There's only 3 left in the free world now. One Nokia, the other Ericsson, and the last one Samsung in Korea. The rest, none in America at the moment. And so the problem is we've become very dependent on them in telecoms. The free world is now utterly dependent on them for telephones, for stuff on the master boards inside telephones, the microprocessors. And then I wrote a piece the other day to say, beyond that, now that the government wants us to go in a hurry to electrical vehicles, public vehicles and also private vehicles, in the rush to do that, of course, everyone's going, we must now have battery vehicles. Well, China dominates the battery production market dramatically, and more than that, it's actually pretty much controls about 95% of what they call the rare earth metals, which are the very, very rare components, which go towards the critical electronics in all the things I've mentioned, microprocessors, telephones, computers, and, of course, batteries, which means essentially that this rush to become electric could actually drive us straight back into the arms of China, and that has to be reviewed.
And we
are actually, I just want to finish on one point that's really important.
Of course.
We are world leaders at the moment in hydrogen technology, in a really, really good and niche area. Instead of maximizing what we're doing here, we yet again seem in a rush to make ourselves dependent. So I'm campaigning to end this dependency with China. I make no bones about it. I have nothing personal against Huawei other than the fact that they're not a normal company by what we would call free market positions. So our job is now to rethink this globalization concept in which China seems to have been the winner.
Well, I couldn't agree more, and I've agreed with you and your fellow MPs on Huawei for a long time. My newspaper, The Sun, obviously campaigned against the Huawei deal as well. But there's an opportunity here, though, isn't there, Ian, where there wasn't before? Because the public previously were not engaged in the Huawei debate. It was something that didn't feel particularly tangible. But that has all changed, because what the coronavirus pandemic has done is open the public's eyes up to the despicable way that the Chinese government operates. Because in this case, they tried to, number one, cover up what was going on at the wet markets. Then, number two, cover up actually the extent of the pandemic. Then, number three, put out these conspiracy theories that it may have been created by the US Army. And the public have now finally said enough is enough. So, do you think that the government, do you think they are going to have to change their position on Huawei because of the public pressure?
I do anyway, because we had a vote on this just before not long before the outbreak, and the government very nearly lost the vote.
Yeah.
Considering they have a huge majority of 80, that's quite significant. And the reason is because their own side, Conservative MPs, simply not bought it. Since then, you're quite right. What's actually happened is that the eyes of the public, if they weren't already open, and many were, have been open to the fact that we are dealing now with a country that enters what I would call the free market of the free world, but makes no compromises. So, for example, you were right. It's a country that doesn't has no obligations towards human rights. It has incarcerated a whole population, the Uyghurs, in correction camps, and many of them, I gather, are actually working, in areas for nothing, being driven there by the Chinese. The same bullying of Hong Kong that's been going on, the bullying of Taiwan,
Terrible.
their position in the South China
Terrible.
Seas, where they've broken all the rules. They do not obey the world order in any shape or form, and yet they take advantage of the democracy's free market. So the problem that you've got here is that all of those mean, for years we were told, don't worry, China opens up to the market, what will happen is eventually democracy will come. It's not going to come. What we've actually got instead is the exact opposite, a greater level of control and more centralization in China, with a level of abuse that goes with it. So I'm not prepared any longer to accept that you can have a country inside this free market that does not obey any of the other rules that the rest of us obey. As I say, democracies with the rule of law, the right to own property, the observance of human rights, and acceptance of the global order in trade, of rules, all of those are what we do. They don't do that. And so Huawei are just part of that, and that's the problem.
And it does feel like the world might be waking up to this. I wonder what you think of what Bruno Le Maire, the French Minister of the Economy and Finance, had to say, because I was not aware of this and I don't know the figures for the UK, but he said 80 to 85% of active ingredients that are in medications that you, I and all of France take are made in China. Do you actually think we can maintain a long-term dependency on medication being made in China, which again feels like a very good point, and I assume we are probably almost as reliant as France on Chinese
Well, this
ingredients.
comes back a lot to the point I made about controlling the production of rare earth metals. So many of these ingredients go into the making of these highly sophisticated pieces of medical equipment as much as they do with computers. The same technology is involved, and therefore the same resources are involved. Now, there are other mines that can do those, but they've all shut down because they can't compete financially. So there's another element of it. And yes, I didn't hear Bruno Le Maire, but he's right about this. I believe after this is over, we absolutely need a complete rethink. Give you an example of this. I was talking to somebody who produces hand sanitizers.
Yes.
Not high technology. I mean, the hand sanitizer is, but the bottle is not. They struggle to get hand sanitizers on the shelves because the plastic dispenser bottles were all made in China. And when China shut down and the coronavirus, they didn't produce them. So that left them very, very caught. And now the world wants more and more. We are somewhat in the hands of China. So I think that the West, the democracies, need to take a strategic view about what's supplied inside democracies and what is supplied in countries that we can't rely on. And I believe China is, frankly, not a country we can rely on. And by the way, there's been cyber attacks from China endlessly over the last few years, and yet we are prepared to see one of their companies, which is, basically financed by the Chinese bank, build and run our systems. And the other thing they do, by the way, and I don't want to impugn anybody, but if you look at the board of Huawei in different countries, it does tend to have the great and the good on it, and who then go out and argue in support of them without declaring that they are somehow involved directly. And I think that this is also a classic example of how they go about it. I'm not going to stop them. It's up to them. It's the point about the way we live. It's a free world. But my point is that this does tend to make it very clear what they're trying to do is strategically place themselves in a controlling position on a whole series of markets.
Absolutely.
We can't allow that any longer.
Yeah, and it's just not a country we can trust in so many ways. Just finally, Iain Duncan Smith, I read a very terrifying piece of scientific analysis the other day that said that there are 700,000 potential viruses right now in the type of animals that are sold in Chinese wet markets that all have the potential, and of course the majority of them won't, but you only need one to transfer again from animals to humans to cause a crisis as bad as this or potentially something much worse. Do you have any trust in the Chinese government's proposal to close wet markets? Because I have to be honest, after what happened following the SARS crisis, where they very briefly shut down the wet markets and then reopened them, I have very limited faith right now.
My answer is no to that question. And I think the real culprit in this, of course, is China. But the big culprit alongside this, I'm afraid, is the World Health Organization. I think at the end of this, they do have some very, very serious questions to answer about their treatment of China in the run to this. Now, when the WHO was headed by a different person, an ex-premier of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, when SARS broke out, she was very tough on China. China, in those days, that's about 9-10 years ago, were not as dominant as they are today in market terms. But she was very hard on them and demanded figures immediately and demanded certain actions of China. And I believe it was that toughness of the WHO that actually got China to implement the right decisions that stopped SARS becoming a pandemic.
Well,
the same could not be said for the WHO this time around. There are big question marks about the leadership that actually visited Beijing, made no comment at all about the coronavirus outbreak in public, and seems to have done nothing about this until far too late.
Well, and so, they even parroted the Chinese propaganda at one point.
Well, exactly. So my question really is, if the police isn't doing their job, who polices the policeman? Well, we do, because we pay the money for this. So my question really is, time is it not for a rethink about the WHO and to make it more effective?
We'll keep fighting the good fight. That is Sir Iain Duncan Smith,